Counselors, approach the bench.
I have no further witnesses, Your Honor.
Curiosity, I'm allowing this freak show to continue.
Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess.
Overruled.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Welcome to Movie Mistrial,
the podcast where we examine the IMDB top 250 and argue for or against the movies being on the list.
My name is Johannes.
And my name is Raji.
And today we have a guest.
Hi, everybody. I am Derick McDuff.
How you doing, Derick?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a writer and a podcaster as well, so I have my own podcast, Underrated, which is kind of the opposite of this show, where we took a look at movies that are kind of underrated and make arguments for why you should like them and they should be considered in the kind of film canon. But yeah, so, I've been kind of in the film, buff for quite some time. I do some freelance stuff with that. But yeah.
Great, sounds great. Sounds like you're the perfect match for the show then.
Yeah, as soon as I saw your show, I was like, okay, I'm down. I want to be a part of this.
Excellent. Raji, what are we talking about today?
We're going to be talking about The Return of the King.
Return of the King. Released on December 17th, 2003, starring Elijah Wood, Viggo Mortensen, and Cate Blanchett.
The culmination of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Yes, and we'll talk about the theatrical cut for this one.
And we'll have a guest to do it with us today.
Correct. Either Raji or I will take a seat back and let the other cross-examine the movie with Derick.
Derick, are you ready to toss the coin?
Yes. Am I flipping it, or are you guys flipping it?
I'll show it to you.
So I'll call heads.
My favorite.
Oh, here we go.
All right. Let's go. Tail.
Okay.
Then let's start. Who do you want to battle against?
Well, I'll go against you. Why not? You're the one who's been communicating with me, I guess, through all this. So let's and then Roger, you can be the judge, I guess.
Yeah, right. I'll be the moderator.
All right.
Sounds good. So Tail. So I get to decide. I'll argue against this movie.
Okay, good. I was in my head. I was like, okay, I've got it. If I have to, I'll come up with some stuff about arguing against it, but it's not going to be in earnest. So I'm glad that that's your decision. So okay, cool.
It's definitely a very hard film to argue against for the most part.
Is it though?
Now I'm curious about what you have to say. I'm really curious. I know a couple of things that I would have said if I had to argue against it, but today I'm the moderator and I'll probably bring it up in the general discussion. So let's see how the conversation goes.
Yeah, let's do that. But before we go there, let's have a synopsis. The culmination of nearly 10 years' work and conclusion to Peter Jackson's epic trilogy based on the timeless J.R.R. Tolkien classic, The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King presents the final confrontation between the forces of good and evil fighting for control of the future of Middle-earth. Hobbits Frodo and Sam reach Mordor in their quest to destroy the One Ring, while Aragorn leads the forces of good against Sauron's evil army at the stone city of Minas Tirith.
The witness will address this court as Judge or Your Honor.
All right, welcome back. Your Honor, The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King is not a great example of a movie that's telling us a story about friendship and adventure. Because ultimately the sense of scale, the stories being set up are resolved in a very sloppy way. And I think it cheapens the movie to a great deal. And it's a failure on the storytelling part to have the leads of this movie just happen to luck out and be able to overcome the issues that are set up in this movie. And just considering that this movie is 3 hours and 20 minutes long, which is plenty of time to fully resolve any conflict that are set up, this movie is not able to do this efficiently and cohesively, which is why I think this movie does not deserve to be this high on this list.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to hard disagree with about everything you said there. You started with saying that the movie it doesn't it's not a good film about friendship, but how can you say that when Sam carries Frodo up a mountain for their friendship? when he says to him, he looks at him and he says, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. This guy will literally do anything for his friend. And then you have, that's just one friendship. You have Merry and Pippin on the other end. They're best friends. They're kind of like your goofy friends. You always know that a pair of people who are always kind of like, maybe they might be stoners or something, but these guys who are always kind of goofing off. And then for the first time in the trilogy, they get separated, and you get to see them kind of like go off and do their own thing to finally be reunited at the end. Then you have the kind of the trio of Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas and their friendship, and you have the back and forth between Gimli and Legolas, where Gimli's like, oh, this one, that still only counts as one. And, they have that kind of competition. And right at the end, when, they realize they're probably about to die, and Gimli, who at the start of the series, in the first film, he's so kind of prejudiced against elves and vice versa. Legolas doesn't think anything of dwarves, and they're about to die next to each other. And you've seen their friendship grow through these 3 movies. And at the end, he looks at him and he says, I never thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf. And he says, what about side by side with a friend? And he says, I could do that. And that just touches your heart in just a way that just, oh my God, that's real deep friendship there that you've got to see build over this. And, this is a long movie. You've got a point there, but it needs that time to give the resolution, not just to this film and to the character arcs in this film, but of the whole 3 film trilogy. Like, this is the culmination of an epic, and it needs that time to give you all these different character resolutions. And I don't think there's anything neat or convenient. I think it does take its time. I'm glad that we are talking about the theatrical, because I think I would have a harder time arguing for the extended edition, because the extended edition is over 4 hours long, and that is too long. There's like a lot of stuff. I do like the extended editions of the first and second one better than the theatrical. The first 2, I think, are about 3 hours with the extended cuts, and that's about how long these movies all feel like they should be, like 3 hours long. So this hits it right at the mark. The stuff they add in the extended, it doesn't really add too much to the film. It's kind of just like nice filler. But with that 3 hours, you do get everything. There is a lot at the end where they are kind of like talking, and you get all these different resolutions, but it's because you have built an emotional connection to all of these different characters. You want to see what's going to happen to Sam, and you want to see what happens to Frodo. You want to see Aragorn finally become king, because that's literally the title of the movie, Return of the King. So you got to see him return to be king. You got to see him reunited with Arwen. Arwen. So all that stuff, it matters so much. And this is the one thing that I will say, that this is the reason this film, even more than maybe the first 2, should be included on the IMDb list, is this film closes out a trilogy in a satisfying way. And I cannot think of really any other movies that close out a trilogy in such a satisfying fashion. There's other good third movies, don't get me wrong, but Indiana Jones 3, for example, isn't continuing the story of Indiana Jones 1. Those are separate movies. This movie is the conclusion, a grand conclusion to this story, this 3-part story this is part 3, it's over and it's done now. It's really hard to do when you look at something like Return of the Jedi, which is a pretty solid film. It doesn't live up. It's a big step down from Empire Strikes Back. It kind of has a cop-out with Luke and Leia being brother and sister. That's how they resolve that love triangle, which is kind of creepy in retrospect. Of all, Godfather 3, that's a huge letdown. Third films, or like endings of trilogies, are really, really difficult. And for this one to pull it off this masterfully, it deserves its spot on the list.
I think you touched on an interesting point. This is the third movie of a trilogy, but if we look at this movie separated from film number 1 and 2, the flaws are really obvious. And I think the time it takes to resolve all these character arcs that arguably start in the first movie, but if we just look at this movie, is just kind of lacking in a lot of points. So Sam, you mentioned Sam and Frodo, and Sam saying, I cannot carry it with you. I cannot carry it for you, but I can carry you. He did carry the ring before. We see it in this movie. So I don't know how I feel about that, because he's kind of lying to his best friend. Merry and Pippin, they're separated. kind of by stupidity, I think. That's not really, like, we see them first kind of hanging out in Isengard, happy and frolicking, and then one of them is giving into to temptation, I think is kind of the motif here. How hobbits kind of give into temptation, and he pays for it. And stupidly, he gives himself up to be a squire then. So I don't necessarily think that there's a good deal of friendship that's displayed here, because they're separated, and it's kind of both go their ways and may die, and it's not like there was a big whoop-de-doo about them being separated at that point. And then Legolas and Gimli, I think the counting that you mentioned is just very poor comic relief at that point. Arguably, there may be some comic relief needed in this instance, but it's childish at that point, and it's kind of ridiculous that they do this in this grandiose battle. And you mentioned cop-outs. I think there's a lot of lazy cop-outs in this movie. The whole resolution of this battle that arguably is kind of being set up in 3 movies, and seems to be a battle that is impossible to win, just happens to be won by a ghost army, which is a crazy cop-out in my opinion. It's just, and they don't even show that anymore. It's just like a little bit of battle, and the ghost army comes in, and it's done. Very lazy writing, in my opinion, and very lazy filmmaking. That the same goes for the time when Sauron gets destroyed, and pretty much all of Mordor kind of gets sunken into the ground, and conveniently our heroes are alive and well because everything around them breaks up. Again, a very easy way to tell the story and to make our heroes come out alive unscathed. And that's what I mean with this as being kind of a lazy movie, and it shouldn't be on this list.
I don't know about that, because I don't think that those are cop-outs, because they are something that are previously established. So, it is established right from the beginning that if you destroy this ring, like they talk about that at the battle, or at the meeting in Rivendell with Agent Smith, Elrond. He talks about how, like, if you destroy all of Sauron's armies are reliant on this ring. If you destroy this ring, Sauron is destroyed forever. And so when that happens, it's the payoff from something 2 movies earlier, the Army of the Dead. That is something that is the first act of this movie. That is kind of Aragorn and Gimli's and Legolas's goal, is to go get this army. That's their whole. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Because they do spend a solid 30 minutes of the film about going to make sure they can get these guys and get them. That's also not the resolution of the whole movie. That's the resolution of the second act. So that battle scene, while it is important, it's not like Helm's Deep was. Helm's Deep in the end of the second film is kind of the culmination of all of that film. That's what all this is building up to. That's why that is such a, that battle when everyone's coming in, and it does, and it has a kind of more satisfying conclusion, because that needs to be the end of the film. Whereas this is just needs to be the end of, I think it's the second act, where it's like, okay, we have established this, we've brought in the Army of the Dead that we're building up. You do see, like, Theoden come in, and you have the resolution of Theoden's arc, and that all kind of gets resolved. And then, and we've defeated this army, but it's just a temporary victory. Sauron's armies are still out there, and we still do need to destroy this ring. And how are we going to do that? We're going to, cause a distraction for them so that Frodo and Sam can get up the mountain.
I think you're bringing up an interesting fact that is also a critique of mine of this movie. It's just very fudgy timelines in this. There was a moment where Gandalf rides from Rohan to Minas Tirith, and he said it's a 3.5 day ride. And then we see the beacon lit, and that's like spanning 15 mountain ranges, at least. That's what it feels like. No way on earth can you do that in 3.5 days. And then there's another fudgy thing with Frodo and Sam kind of going up the stairs, and we hear that, what's the son's name in the city? He said that he saw them
Faramir?
2 days ago. Yeah, he saw them 2 days ago. Meanwhile, they're already pretty close up in Mordor, or they're very close to being there. So there's a lot of weird timeline stuff that happens here that just kind of doesn't add up. And again, feels very convenient. It's like, oh, we have all these different things that are kind of related, and people see each other, but we snap and it's done, and people can do this.
I don't know. I feel like, I'm curious out there because I haven't mapped it out myself, but I feel like, there are like these big, like, people map out the Lord of the Rings and like the journeys that everybody had to go on, and how long certain things would take, and riding over this terrain and stuff like that. So I'm curious if there's any listeners out there who could, because I don't have the exact, I don't know what the dimensions of Middle Earth are, but like that's the kind of the thing is like I don't know, like this could take however amount of time. That never even occurred to me that it was like, oh yeah, these guys are going too fast. It's not like Game of Thrones season 7 where some people can seemingly teleport. I do actually get the feeling like they have been on a journey and that they are kind of cutting away. This movie does feel like, while it's cutting quickly, it is taking, characters are taking their time to get somewhere. It's been 2 days, but since he was there, but like they do establish that place where they met Faramir was actually pretty close to Mordor, so it makes sense that they could get there in that time, especially if they have Gollum, who like knows all the different shortcuts and ways to kind of lead them up to the mountain and stuff like that, or to the Shelob's lair.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think there is a quality of teleportation in this, especially around Gandalf, kind of going back and forth between locations very quickly. And sure, you're a wizard, right? So you can do that, I guess. But it just feels very convenient and easy and sloppy and that.
I'm going to interject here just a little bit to kind of sway the conversation in one direction. I think one of the conversations, I know you're currently talking about the timelines being distorted, but I want to go back to the original documentation about the themes of friendship. And I know that Derick mentioned quite a lot about, this movie is about friends. But I wanted to bring up a couple of points, and maybe that can add to the conversation. How do you feel about the themes of friendship and responsibility going against each other? For example, when Aragorn was going to go into the rock, between the mountains to meet the army of the dead, he almost abandoned his friends to take responsibility for that action. Another example was Sam and Frodo, who we have known to be friends since the first two films, and the way Frodo abandoned Sam for Gollum at the drop of a hat because they couldn't find food, and the very end of the film where Frodo abandoned his friends when he decided to go to the land of the elves and take the boat, and he never told anybody he was doing that. He just jumped on the boat and abandoned his friends. Do you feel like the theme of friendship, which you gave an example of a few minutes ago, saying like, hey, Sam carried Frodo to the very end. Do you think that is still a strong argument if you have to juxtapose that against the theme of responsibility that each of the characters have to go through?
Yeah, because I'll go through all the things you mentioned, I think, because I think, like, for example, you said, the first thing you said was that Aragorn is abandoning his friends to go into the mountains. I don't think that's abandoning. I think he cares about his friends, and he says, this is my responsibility, my own, and I'm not going to put my friends' lives in danger, so I'm not going to put that pressure on them. And then they, of course, come back with, like, saying, hey, you know what, we're coming with you whether you like it or not. And he's like, all right, well, let's go, And he does take them along with him, even though he's like, I want to protect my friends, but they're going to be here by my side, even though this is my responsibility. They are my friends, and I'm taking them with me. So he wanted to watch out for them at first, but then he's like, you know what, let's go. And you talked about Frodo abandoning Sam. Yeah, that is an example of him being a bad friend. That is something he is being corrupted by the ring. The ring is taking this friendship that Frodo and Sam had and distorting it, and Sam's not feeling those effects really, but Frodo definitely is. And that's why, there is, that is a low point in their friendship. But then when you get back to it and he starts carrying him up the mountain, it's the catharsis for that. It is kind of the resolution. It's like he's like, hey, look, Frodo kind of looks at Sam. He's like, yeah, I was a bad friend. And Sam's like, you know what? I don't care that you were a bad friend before. I'm still here for you, no matter what. Because there's times when, your friends do you dirty. They do you wrong. But your real friends are going to forgive you for that, just like Sam does for Frodo. And when Frodo leaves at the end, it's not him abandoning his friends. It's just that he has been living with this like pain. He's been dying, like just like he can't live with this inside. So he's got to kind of just move on. And sometimes your friends got to move on, and they got to go somewhere else in life and leave you behind and move on to whatever else they got going. Like I remember when me and my best friend were living together for a while, and he got engaged and he moved out, and he wasn't abandoning me. He was going to go live with his life and move on to this better part of his life so that he could be his best self. And we hugged and we cried and stuff, and we had a great time together on our last night. And he left, and he's doing great still. And that's what Frodo was doing. He was moving on to his best self. You had to, sometimes in life, it's sad, but you kind of gotta say goodbye to your friends because life just pushes you in different directions for whatever reason. But that doesn't mean that your friendship is any less real.
I think Sam and Frodo, I think the main takeaway from that is corruption and how the ring is just kind of affecting people. I give the movie that. I still think that that whole sentence of I carried you, like I cannot carry the ring, but I can carry you is kind of cheap. But at the end, like Raji said, Frodo still kind of abandons their friendship and just kind of moves on to greener pastures, which is kind of an interesting conclusion to that friendship, I guess. Aragorn, that whole scene with him going into the mountains to get the pirate army or the ghost army, again, I feel like it's very sloppy in that the resolve was clear to him, right? He was the king of Gondor. He had the sword, so he knew they were bound to him, and they needed to help him, calling the favor. So there was no real stakes there. And Gimli and Legolas following him into the mountains was just a convenient way to do an exposition dump with which is something this movie does a lot. You always have somebody pandering about, oh, the Ghost Army is doing this and doing that, or the Nazgul. These are the Nazgul and they do evil things. And it's all just exposition dump and, telling us about the evils of this and not really showing us. And I think this movie does that a lot. And it's sloppy. Again, it's very sloppy. Kind of the cop-out.
See, the thing though, when he goes to that, okay, like as a movie, you're like, that he is going to go and get this ghost army and that's the way it's going to go. But they do manage to build some tension into that. They do say, oh, you would go to them. They are traitors. They are liars. They are murderers. So that this ghost army, while Aragorn is, their only way out, they are traitors. They've betrayed a king of Gondor before. When they were summoned to fight before, they have just gone back on their word. So you don't know that they are going to keep their word this time. They might go back on it again because these are untrustworthy people. These are untrustworthy ghost armies. So while it is in their best interest, you can assume to work for them and that you want to strike a deal, you don't know. This is an evil ghost king. He might have his ulterior motives or something else. So it does kind of build that tension. With the exposition dumps, I think that, there is a lot of exposition in this, but I really don't mind it. I think that it is, the way it's doled out is kind of, it feels epic and interesting, and it's like you're hearing this interesting history of the world, like this lore that I am really kind of interested in. It's very cool. It's like when you hear about all these different, battles and kings and the history of all these different armies, it is something that you're invested in. And I think they cut out, there's a lot more of that in the extended edition. They cut it down to just kind of like what the essentials that you need to know in this. So, when they are doling out this information, I'm never bored. I'm always like, oh, that's cool, that's interesting, and, like, what's this guy doing now? So it does exposition in a kind of effective way, I feel.
All right, I have one last point to make, and then that concludes my arguments. Let's talk visual effects in this. Granted, this movie is 18 years old now. Or like when they filmed it, probably 20 years ago. But oh boy, does stuff here look bad. Especially when it comes around trying to sell the hobbits and the scale of the hobbits in relation to other characters that are on screen. A lot of very funky stuff happens when you look at that. When you have one of them kneeling in front of a wall and arms crossed in front of him, and the arms look freakishly large because this character is kneeling and the arms are out of scale for that. When you have weird composite shots, when you have obviously kids standing in and moving like not like old people but like kids, and it's so sloppy again. Like, I feel this movie is just very sloppy and on so many fronts, which is why I don't think should not be on this list.
All right, well, respectfully, I could not disagree more with everything you just said, because this movie, for me, from a special effects standpoint, is incredible. Like, especially when you compare it to something else that came in at the same time. Watch The Mummy Returns. Holy, like, that movie, it's like, even it's like your eyes are melting because it's so bad. Because this came in the time when CG was just kind of starting to be like, this is a tool that we can use. You'd had your Jurassic Parks and your Titanics. So it was a tool that you could use to, like, elevate something, but it wasn't like so many films are today where that was the only tool. So they did use a lot of those practical effects where, they have body doubles and stuff like that. And there's every once in a while give you a time when you're like, that looks a little bit wonky, but most of the time you're like, this looks pretty solid. And it kind of came out in that, like, I call it the golden age of CG, not because it's the best CG, because CG is obviously better now, but because they would only use CG to buffer up the practical effects, or when they couldn't use practical effects. Like, they made all the sets they called them bigatures, when they would make a whole, just like 1/4 scale of Minas Tirith, and they would just show that getting destroyed, like run water over it or whatever. It looks incredible, and then they'll put CG stuff in it to kind of like make it look like little people or whatever it might be, to make it kind of look more real. Compare that to, for example, The Hobbits, which, obviously it's the same people who made it. It's a lot of, it's the same stories that it's based on. Those movies look worse than this, despite those movies coming out 10, 12 years later. And if you look at, like, for example, the orcs in The Hobbit, they're all CG. They're all motion captured. They're all, basically what they reserved for Gollum, pretty much the only character who, by the way, like, how can you say this movie is, bad special effects when it had Gollum in it, one of the most groundbreaking special effects of all time, to something that's still being, they still use mocap based on, like, what they did with Gollum to this day. But they use that for everyone in the Hobbit trilogy. Like,
I think I think you see a lot of the wonkiness and the kind of uncanny valley central stuff is around the stuff that's real. Like, a lot of the orc masks they did, the Gollum transition from Smeagol to Gollum. Like, there was a lot of instances where it was like,
man, I don't know.
That looks pretty rough.
I don't know. The Gollum, I felt like the Gollum that you see, or not the Gollum, but the orcs you see, like, in this, looks so much better than the orcs you see in The Hobbit, because they are, like, real. They're, they have the makeup, and that takes them like 12 hours to put on. The guy Gothmog, who's the guy with all the, big deformities and stuff on his face, that looks incredible. It looks so much better than, like, a CG thing would look. And I think that the practical blended with the CG in this does such a good job. And you see Gollum's transition from, like, a real person. You have real and a circus, and you kind of get the makeup, and then by the end of it, like, you see him as the Gollum, and I think that transition is done actually pretty solidly.
Like I said, I felt it was very wonky, and my main complaint is mostly around the hobbits and kind of how they fit into the real world and real size human characters in relation to them. There's a lot of weird stuff that happens, and it just looks very odd. It has not aged well, I don't think. And it took me out of the movie for that reason. It's like, oh, okay. They really tried to make it work with kids or with kneeling people.
I feel like it's aged so much better than anything else at the time. Like you like I said, watch A Mummy Returns, and the Rock in that movie, the CG Rock, or like the CG armies that they have, it really does not hold up well to the eye. Whereas this movie, because you get that blend, I think it does. You're never sometimes you're like, okay, I think that's CG, but I think that's practical, but you're never quite sure 100% of the time, what is and what isn't. Whereas now, like if you're watching a big Marvel movie, you can be like, okay, yeah, this is all CG. Like this is what this is. Whereas that you get these grand scale models that they just don't make movies like this anymore, and it really is a shame.
Well, I think you kind of cherry pick your bad movies that have bad CG. You also brought up two movies that are from this time that are a lot more successful in terms of CG, Titanic and Jurassic Park, and it's not as obvious, and they really aged well.
Oh man, I don't know. Like I think Titanic does. I think those both movies both do a lot of similar things. Jurassic Park is a lot less CG and a lot more practical. But like Titanic, while I think that generally holds up. Remember that propeller scene? That looked bad, and that CG propeller scene where the guy falls and hits the propeller. That holds up worse than anything in this film, as far as I'm concerned.
It's riffed upon in this movie, by the way.
What part?
The propeller scene, like when someone falls down.
Where is it?
In Minas Tirith, I think.
Okay.
You can see somebody tumbling down and then do the same thing. Anywho, that's all my arguments I have.
Yeah, no, I guess, that's about it for me, other than I will just say, this film, it's just such a display of, prolific writing, great actors all the way. We haven't even touched on how incredible, like Ian McKellen and just everyone else, all the actors in this do such a good job. It's really a labor of love from everyone involved. It's incredible that New Line Cinema was like, yeah, you can shoot these 3 movies back to back to back. And it really changed movies kind of the way we watch them today. So if anything else, it should be on the list just because of the impact that it made. It's like now everything needs to be kind of a trilogy. Everything needs to kind of have like a story over more than one movie. For better or for worse, it has impacted the film industry. And, I do like a series that ends. So many things nowadays don't end, and this is like, hey, this is a solid ending to a film franchise. Even like stuff like The Dark Knight Rises gets picked apart because it's hard, like I said before, and I'll just reiterate it again, it's hard to end film franchises because endings are tough, and this does that in spades.
Well, endings are tough, but we'll end this session right now.
Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess.
All right. Let's talk about this movie kind of outside of the scope of a discussion. Just gonna talk about it.
Yeah, well, I think it was interesting to hear everybody's conversations about this film. But there's one thing that kept coming up. Endings are tough. But this movie ending was long and never ending. I'm surprised it didn't come up in the conversation. This movie frustrated me because the movie could have ended at any point. It could have ended where Aragorn said, "Nobody kneels to you," and he says like when you kneel to no one, when Frodo and his friends were about to kneel. And the movie could have ended there, and it would have been a great stop to point to end. Then we get to see them go back home. We get to see them get married. We get to see them live in the house. We get to see Frodo leave. And I felt like it was a little bit indulgent from the director to have a lot of those ending scenes. Like, I feel like given the success of the 2 films, the studio was like, well, you can do whatever the hell you want. And I think that was the beginning of all the problems you were going to have with The Hobbit. Because at that point, Peter Jackson had too much power and he could do no wrong. And we got The Hobbit after that. I feel like the endings were overindulgent, and I feel like they could have ended it it could have been a little bit more concise.
No, and then that we're out of the argument here, you do have a point. The endings do go on a while. I mean, I like it personally. I don't know how effective they are as like just a film for general audiences, but I'm kind of the person who's just like, if I'm liking something and it's like, we're going to give you some more, I'm like, yeah, cool. I do want to kind of know like what happened to everybody. You know, I'm the person who will go home and like Wikipedia, like, well, I didn't get an ending for Legolas and Gimli. What happened to them? You know, so it does indulge me in that kind of aspect. I feel like I do like some longer movies more than others. It's not as bad as something like, I think, like, did you guys see the Snyder cut of Justice League? Like the way they just there was like more in there, were that the endings in that one that was like, okay, I get it, there's another ending, okay, now they're like, now the Joker's here, cool, now he's talking to the Green Lantern or like whatever, or the Martian Manhunter. It's just like, okay, that felt exhausting in a way that this didn't. You know what I mean? Because I was just really invested in all these storylines. But I can see why people think it's a little bit long, and that was actually going to be one of my arguments if I had to argue against it.
I think that your point about how this movie influenced other films, I think that was one of the influences it had. Let me be clear. I think this movie is amazing. It's an incredible masterpiece, especially given the context that this is the third of 3 films. And I think that Peter Jackson deserves a lot of credit for sticking the landing for the most part. I think that a lot of the arguments you guys made were very, very good about, you know, some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses of the films. But I don't think the movie is perfect either. I think that, you know, one of the things that I did not like was, you know, the king, the guy who was what's the name of the character who rides the horse, the flying horse? No, the one that, you know, screamed while Frodo was close to the entrance of Mordor, that said that it feels like it's stabbing me.
The Witch King?
I think it was
think about?
The Witch King,
yeah.
Yes, the Witch King. I felt like that character was undercooked significantly because, in a sense, you know, what's his name? Gandalf kept talking about him in such blazing terms. Like, this guy, what's his name? I'm not very good with names, as you can tell. Sauron has not unleashed his greatest weapon, the Witch King, and he can take on anything. And we see in so many instances that he can't take on light. He can't take on, you know, the scene where Gandalf was galloping towards them and had his wand with the bright light, and all of them ran away. He can't handle anybody who is not male.
Hashtag girl power.
Know, yeah, he's so given all the hype, I feel like we didn't get a lot from his character too. I just feel like that was a bit undercooked. But I will say that there are some themes in the film that don't seem very obvious. Like the scene where Frodo was trying to kill Gollum and had his hand on his throat, and he never got to do it. And if you juxtapose that against the very beginning of the film where he killed his cousin for the ring, you kind of know where the breaking point is for anybody who has the ring.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point with that scene, with how it's mirrored and how the music is mirrored there too. You have that heartbeat kind of pumping and getting faster and faster and faster, but Frodo is able to resist.
Yeah. Well, then it calls back to like that scene that Frodo has with Gandalf in the first one when he says something about like, oh, it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill him, because it does, you know, kind of like Bilbo had a chance to kill him with that same sword, you know, back in the Hobbit days, and Gandalf says like, it's pity that, you know, it stayed on his hand, that like, and he's like, by the end of this there will be, you know, something that like in the end, like he will have a big part to play, whether for good or evil. And you see at the end, because Frodo and Bilbo spared his life, he ends up being the one who like falls over and destroys the ring. Like if he doesn't destroy the ring, then Frodo keeps the ring and Sauron gets it, and they lose. So because he bites off his finger and falls over the cliff and melts with the ring, you know, it's actually, you know, Frodo and Bilbo's pity not murdering him, that the fact that they were able to not give in wholly into this temptation like Smeagol did, shows that, you know, kind of like pity and redemption can be things that, like, even if it seems bad at the time, have these ripples that just you can't even possibly imagine.
So yeah, I agree. I think that you bringing up that point is quite interesting. I think that I never thought about that particular aspect from that perspective. So it's interesting that even in that criticism that I have, Peter Jackson was able to give us a solution. The fact that because he didn't kill him, he was the one who eventually gets the ring down and he dies with what he loves. I mean, I guess it's a testament to how perfectly crafted the film was. I mean, except from the very end, which took forever, the movie was just both entertaining and quite interesting to watch. I think the thing that fascinates me also is it's difficult to unsee the extended version when you see this version. I was because I watched it with my wife. So my wife is a big fan of The Lord of the Rings, and we got to watch. We watched the extended versions a few months ago, and we got to watch this version again, and it was very interesting because I kept going through scenes going. Like the beginning of the film when the gallop into Sauron's lair after the hobbits were drinking and eating the food and, you know, celebrating the downfall. It was a funny scene to watch, but a lot of the context for where the Palantir came from, you know, Sauron, it came from the water and the conversation they had with Sauron. All of that was removed, and I kept watching the film going, oh man, something is missing. It's like I feel like I missed something here.
Yeah, you're watching, you're like, where's all the scenes? Like, it just feels incomplete, you know, but it's, I know exactly what you mean, because I had the same experience, because I've watched the extended so many times, and it's like, oh yeah, there's the Army of the Dead doesn't chase them out, you know, like, you know, there's not that there's like whole big chunks that are, like, there's an hour, you know, there's just missing that I feel like should be there.
Yeah, but that's kind of what I meant with, like, it's very convenient in this cut because it's like he shows up, they have an exposition about the Army of the Dead, he shows the sword, and then they show up and save the day. So like, it's...
Yeah, you don't get as much exposition around the Army of the Dead in this cut.
Yeah, it's convenient, right? And it's just kind of, like I said, that big battle that is set up is just kind of resolved off screen for the most part.
I totally agree with you on that Army of the Dead. I think it's one of the weakest parts of the film. And I think it's too convenient. Like you said, it's too convenient how everything, he just goes in, hey, I have this sword now. You guys got to listen if you want to die, really die, you know, and next thing you know, they just come and they just get rid of the whole army coming in from that side of from the coast. And you know, it was yeah, it's definitely a weak point.
One thing I was surprised you didn't with the convenience thing. Like, one thing that I feel like is convenient. I know it's explained in the books, and people are gonna yell at us, whatever. The Eagles, you know, like I'm really surprised you didn't mention that when you're talking about convenience and laziness, because I felt like I disagree with you with a lot of this stuff, but with the Eagles, I can like totally see that point, you know. So that's like, okay, I was like, I don't know if I have a rebuttal for that one, but you never brought it up, so I was like, all right, I'm safe here.
They said that the Eagles moved away from the lands of the humans because they were shooting them down, but somehow if they appeared at Mordor in the land of orcs to save Frodo, it seems very, very weird.
Yeah, that kind of you know, I know it's explained and stuff in the appendices and everything, but in the context of the movie, they just like show up, and that's they just like they're like, how are they this close to Mordor? That's teleportation. But and I do think like overall, like, this is my least favorite of the Lord of the Rings. I still love this movie. It's still like a masterpiece to me, but I think the first two edge it out. You know, I think the first two are like some of the best films ever, and this one is like a it's still, I would say, you know, even aside from being on the podcast, does deserve to be on the top 250, but not as high as number 1 and 2. I think, like, just objectively or subjectively, you know, if I'm not on, you know, not on trial anymore, if this is off the record.
Yeah, no, it's off the record. I totally agree with you. I think I used to think that The Lord of the Rings 3 was my favorite. But like I said, I watched the extended version with my wife, and I found that the first one, which I didn't like as much previously, I gained a lot more respect for that film. The second one is still my favorite, but if I had to go with respect to ratings, I'll say it's the second one, then the first one, then the third one. Because the third one, they used a lot of things that they used in the second one, in the third one. Like, oh, we're in a castle, we're almost destroyed, but there's more of it now. So it's almost like we had seen all of that before. So it didn't feel as crazy to me. But the first one, Helm's Deep was just one crazy battle.
The Helm's Deep sequence is literally one of the greatest film sequences ever made. Like, it's incredible. Like, you could just study that, like, and on its own is better than most movies. Just like the Helm's Deep part.
It's like I'm gonna have fandoms collide now, but it's kind of like Star Wars, where Empire is the best, and then.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I mentioned, Return of the Jedi, it's just, it couldn't live up to, because Empire is so good, and then Return of the Jedi is like, that was another Death Star, and it's even bigger, and it's just like, okay.
I mean, same here, right? There's another army, and it's even bigger, so it's like...
Yeah.
I'm surprised that the Return of the King is also is much higher than the other two on this list. I see, this is the thing that is always confusing me about this IMDb 250. I don't understand, how Shawshank Redemption is number one.
Yeah, Shawshank is good, but it's number one movie of all time. Like, come on, get out of here! Get the fuck out of here!
I think that the Lord of the Rings should be higher than Shawshank Redemption. Mm-hmm. The Godfather 2 should be higher than Shawshank Redemption. The Lord of the Rings 2 should be higher than Shawshank Redemption. So it's very interesting. Who are the people who are judging these films and putting them up? I guess it's the general population, and it says a lot that Shawshank Redemption is number one, because there's a religious aspect to it, and you all know that America is somewhat of a religious country. So I don't know. It's quite interesting, though.
Yeah, and I think I get why this one is the highest of the three Lord of the Rings, because, I think of all this stuff I was saying about, like, it manages to end it well, and I think people are, like, satisfied, like, be like, okay, like, when you get a conclusion, you're like, that made me feel good. Like, there is this catharsis with an ending, whereas, like, with the 1 and 2 ending on the cliffhangers, I can see why people are like, okay, but I need more, and this is like, okay, good, you're not expecting any more. I think it's also why Endgame, I don't think is the best Marvel movie, but I think that it's the fact that it wraps up all these movies in such an effective manner is insane. Like, all these different film franchises and the Avengers and Thor and Captain America and Iron Man all get these satisfying conclusions. I think that's nuts, and that's why that movie, while it might not be as tight as like an Infinity War, like, it does get more points and is higher up on a lot of people's lists, probably including mine, because it does all these things. And I think it's the same case with Lord of the Rings: Return of the King.
Yeah. Both of you mentioned that earlier, that it kind of set up the movie industry for splitting up movies into a lot. And I felt like Peter Jackson fell into his own trap there with The Hobbit. That was a big mistake to break that up into 3 movies.
Well, he wanted to do it as 2 films, and he shot it as 2 films, but then Warner Brothers was like, hey, what would make us more money is if it was 3 films. And I think you can really feel that, especially like in the second and third, how there was just like those should not have been 2 movies. Like, I think if somebody cut it down to like 2 or 1 film, like if some editor out there, like, I'm sure this exists, but, like, I think it would be a much tighter, much more, like, because all that stuff at the end of the second one where they were, like, running from the gold and, like, it's, like, becomes, like, a zany madcap thing where they're like, get away from smog. And it's just, like, that is all borderline unwatchable to me. And so I think it's, studios just being like, how can we make as much money? Like, you see Pirates 2 and 3, they're like, okay, we're going to retroactively make the Pirates of the Caribbean movies a trilogy, so you have 2 and 3, which are just basically one long movie. But they're like, just kidding, we just want to make more movies. So then it's like weird, because it's like 1 and then 2 and 3 together, and then 4 and then 5. So it's like that whole series just seems so weird because, like, of the knee-jerk reaction to this kind of film. So I don't know. Yeah, it's we don't get a lot of standalone movies anymore. Like, it's a lot of standalone. Or I shouldn't say don't get a lot of like big budget standalone sequels where it's just like, yeah, this is the, other than maybe like I guess probably like the last one I can think of is Star Trek Beyond, because I was talking about that recently on my podcast, and how that one just kind of like does stand on its own. It doesn't try to continue from like Into Darkness or the first Star Trek. It's just like, this is its own story. Now everything kind of needs to be all one continuing story. So I think it's that, Lord of the Rings, and the MCU, just kind of like everything needs to tie together, which I appreciate, but it doesn't need to be every movie.
Yeah, and I think that we had this trend of movies that split the finale into, like Harry Potter did it.
Yeah.
There's a couple movies that did
the Hunger Games.
All the ones that based on teen books, Harry Potter, Hunger Games.
Yeah, it's like milk it even further, and I think that's kind of the influence that this had. And The Hobbits, I think there's like 2 big fan edit versions out there that you can download and watch.
I think you should. I think Peter Jackson should release the Hobbit retracted edition.
Right? Yeah. Enough with the extended cuts, retracted cuts. That's the new trend.
I couldn't. I think that you mentioned the Hobbit while you were having the discussion about the movies, and you mentioned that the CGI in the Hobbit were horrible.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the reasons why the movie doesn't sit well with me. Because the original trilogy, the makeup, I know that the makeup and all of that stuff was a production nightmare. You had to sit down for hours every day doing all of that. But then you have the total extreme where the movie doesn't feel based in reality. The characters feel like they're floating on the scene, and they don't feel like they're in place. And you don't get a very, very... it doesn't feel like it's based in reality. I mean, it's a fantasy film, of course, but it doesn't feel grounded. It doesn't feel grounded like the Lord of the Rings felt grounded. And I think that they took a lot of things. But this is not the Hobbit criticism. I never finished the trilogy. I only watched the first 2, and I was like, I think I'm done.
Watch just like the first 10 minutes of the third film, right? Because the beginning of that is like what should have been the end of the second film. And then it's weird because like you have it's like almost like a prologue, but it's just the ending for the second one. And then as soon as like they kill Smaug and he attacks the city, and then it's just like the title of the movie comes up, and you're like, okay, whatever. That's all you need. Just watch until the desolation of Smaug appears on the screen. That's all you need.
All right. I'll probably. My wife watches a lot of this fantasy films. But I will say that just as The Lord of the Rings brought in a film that a series that ends, the Marvel series is an octopus that never ends now.
Yeah.
And I think that it's quite interesting to see the influence of The Lord of the Rings on the Marvel series, because they had cliffhangers on every single film except the last one. And they're basically doing the same thing with the Marvel films now. So The Lord of the Rings definitely had a big influence on the structure of some of these films.
Yeah, I think the fault in air quotes of the MCU is just oversaturation at this point. It's just too much of the same, in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's why I was kind of like, it was nice last year when there wasn't really any MCU stuff, because as much as like I'm like a Marvel shill, like, and I love all that stuff, I'm like, okay, it's good to have a little break, like where I'm not having to think about like, oh my god, what's going to happen in Black Widow and how's that going to affect like Captain Falcon or Captain America and the Winter Soldier and all this. Like, it's just like nice to be like, okay, we can take a breather.
Yeah, yeah,
True.
Definitely. The thing that seemingly the MCU did set up is the whole end credit scene thing, and I might be wrong. So. But that's.
I mean, it was around before, but it was like usually it would just kind of be like a little joke or something. It wasn't like as prevalent as it is now. Like now, that's like a thing.
Yeah.
And before it was like, oh, Ferris Bueller just tells you to go home, and now it's just like, oh man, stick around to the end credits because this character is going to show up and it's going to have implications for this movie. So I think that's just genius on Kevin Feige's part.
Definitely. All right. Well, I'm not entirely sure I have much more to say about The Lord of the Rings.
I probably have too much more, so I need to stop at some point.
It will be interesting to see when we get to the first Marvel films, and maybe we can have the rant about Marvel films.
Is there any
but
Marvel film on the list?
I'm not entirely sure. I think that the next film, what's the next film on the list? Is it the Quentin Tarantino film?
Yes, Pulp Fiction.
Oh man, I love that film. I
That's
hope
a good one. I prefer Reservoir Dogs, but that's still a solid movie.
Yeah, I'm a big Quentin Tarantino fan. Much to anyway, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, no Marvel film in the top 50, so we'll be spared from Marvel.
There's got to be one. There's got to be one in the top 250 though at some point.
Yeah, eventually, I would think.
Yeah,
but it's surprising that we got a DC film, and I think that the Dark Knight movie.
Oh, I was thinking like a DC, like what the current DC films. So I was like, what? And I was like, oh, the Dark Knight. That makes sense. Every film bro loves the Dark Knight.
Yeah, but I think mostly it's because of Heath Ledger. I mean, we've had this discussion, right? Yeah. Heath Ledger is the reason why that movie is even in the top 10. Because if you remove Heath Ledger from the film, the movie is not as strong.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a totally different topic too.
Yep.
Yeah. Hot take: I like Batman Begins actually the best of Nolan's Batman films. I know that's an unpopular opinion, but I love Batman Begins.
I think that previously it was The Dark Knight for me, but after watching it again, the Batman Begins is what I think that's the most coherent of all his stories, and I think it's the one that gives Batman the strongest showing. Every other one, Batman is a side character in the film.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, Derick, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's great. Where can people find you? Let's start there.
So yeah, you can find me, like I'd mentioned at the top, I've got the podcast Underrated. So you can find that however you're listening to this podcast, it'll be there because we're on all the podcasting apps, and we're also on YouTube. You can also follow us. Me and my friends are the Undercast Company, so follow us on Instagram or Facebook, Undercast Company, Undercast Co. at Twitter, or if you just want to follow me and more of my film writing and stuff like that, just follow. You can check me out on Medium or on Instagram at Derick's Photos with an underscore between Derick and Photos. So yeah,
cool. Raji, where can people find us?
You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Movie Mistrial. And you can also send us emails at moviemistrial@gmail.com, as well as
contact at moviemistrial.com.
All right.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Until next time for Pulp Fiction.